Leap Castle in County Offaly, Ireland, is an Irish paranormal enigma by its history and reputation as the Republic's most haunted house. The castle has a long and bloodied history, as one might expect. It was most likely built around 1250 AD, and accounts of its construction can place it as late as the 15th century. But regardless of age, its bloody history adds much to its allure for any researcher or investigator of the paranormal. Built by the Edwardian clan, they were secondary in power to the O'Carroll clan, who eventually took possession, and many gruesome murders took place within its stone-cold walls. When a chief died without naming an heir, his two sons, Taig and Thaddeus, fell in dispute over the rightful owner. It was settled when Taig murdered Thaddeus, a priest, while he was taking mass inside the castle's chapel. Because of this dark deed and the fact that it also contained an oubliette hidden behind a wall, it became known as the Bloody Chapel, and in the 1920s many skeletal remains were found buried in the oubliette. There were so many, in fact, that it took several cartloads to remove them. Allegedly, the castle was haunted by the roaming spirit of Thaddeus, and also that of a woman dressed in red and carrying a knife. She was a victim of the O'Carrolls, who raped her repeatedly, and she gave birth, and the O'Carrolls murdered her baby. Her spirit remains at the castle, looking for the men who committed this heinous crime. Among the other active ghosts of this castle is the tale of Emily and Charlotte. They lived on the estate during the 1600s. Emily died aged 11 after falling from the castle's battlements. Charlotte had a deformed leg and is sometimes seen, but more often heard, dragging her leg as she walks. Some years ago, I carried out an investigation at the castle and actually listened to this sound inside the Bloody Chapel. Also, two other investigators claimed to have seen the lady in red, but unfortunately they fled in terror before attempting to record her presence on camera. And Sean Ryan, the owner, claimed that a visiting nun to the chapel had seen some raggedy children whom she thought were real. During the 17th century, the daughter of the O'Carrolls fell in love with an English prisoner named Darby. They decided to elope, but in the process he met her brother, his jailer, on the stairwell, and in the ensuing duel he killed him. As there was no male heir, the daughter inherited the estate, and thus it passed to the Darby family when he married her. In their possession it remained until 1922, when Jonathan and Mildred Darby were forced to flee the castle during the Irish Rebellion. The castle was set to flame, along with two side extensions built by the family in earlier years. I was told that the Darbys refused to accept the Irish Home Rule and had mistreated their tenants, which fueled the ensuing fire. Mildred was a prolific author writing under the pseudonym of Andrew Merry, and much of her unpublished works were destroyed by the flames. And one aspect of the haunting she wrote about was the spiritual presence of an entity called the Elemental. Mildred wrote about the ghosts she encountered, the seances she held, and the disturbing story of Leap's past throughout her life. Mildred Darby was said to have dabbled in the occult. Apart from the seances, she also practiced automatic writing. Some think it was her dabbling that either awoke or summoned the elemental. This account of hauntings at Leap Castle was published originally as True Irish Ghost Stories by St. John D. Seymour and Harry L. Nelligan in 1914.
Leap Castle, in the heart of Ireland, has been described as perhaps the worst haunted mansion in the British Isles. That it deserves this doubtful recommendation, we cannot say, but at all events, the ordinary reader will be prepared to admit that it contains sufficient ghosts to satisfy the most greedy ghost hunter. A couple of months ago, the present writer paid a visit to this castle and was shown all over it one morning by the mistress of the house, who, under the nom de plume of Andrew Merry, has published novels dealing with Irish life, and has also contributed articles on the ghostly phenomena of her. The place itself is a grim, grey, bare building. The central portion, in which is the entrance hall, is a square castle of the usual type. It is built on a rock, and a slight batter from base to summit gives an added appearance of strength and solidity. On either side of the castle are more modern wings, one of which terminates in what is known as the priest's house. Now to the ghosts. The top story of the central tower is a large, well-lighted apartment called the chapel, having evidently served that purpose in times past. At one end is what is said to be an oubliette, now almost filled up. Occasionally, in the evenings, people walking along the roads or in the fields see the windows of this chapel lighted up for a few seconds as if many lamps were suddenly brought into it. This is certainly not due to servants. From our experience, we can testify that it is the last place on earth that a domestic would enter after dark. It is also said that a treasure is buried somewhere in or around the castle. The legend runs that an ancestor was about to be taken to Dublin on a charge of rebellion, and fearing he would never return, made the best of the time left to him by burying somewhere a crock full of gold and jewels. Contrary to expectation, he did return, but his long confinement had turned his brain, and he could never remember the spot where he had deposited his treasure years before. Some time ago, a lady, a Miss B, who was decidedly psychic, was invited to Leap Castle in the hope that she would be able to locate the whereabouts of this treasure. In this respect she failed, unfortunately, but gave, nevertheless, a curious example of her power. As she walked through the hall with her hostess, she suddenly laid her hand upon the bare stone wall and remarked, "There is something uncanny here, but I don't know what it is." In that very spot, some time previously, 2 skeletons had been discovered walled up. The sequel to this is curious. Some time after, Miss B was either trying automatic writing or else was at a séance, we forget which, when a message came to her from the unseen, stating that the treasure at the Leap Castle was concealed in the chapel under the tessellated pavement near the altar. But this spirit was either a lying spirit or else a most impish one, for there is no trace of an altar, and it is impossible to say from the style of the room where it stood, while the tessellated pavement, if it exists, is so covered with the debris of the former roof that it would be almost impossible to have it thoroughly cleared. There is as well a miscellaneous assortment of ghosts. A monk with tonsure and cowl walks in at one window of the priest's house and out at another. There is also a little old man, dressed in the antique garb of a green cutaway coat, knee breeches, and buckled shoes. He is sometimes accompanied by an old lady in similar old-fashioned costume. Another ghost has a penchant for lying on the bed beside its lawful and earthly occupant. Nothing is seen, but a great weight is felt, and a consequent deep impression made on the bedclothes. The lady of the house states that she has a number of letters from friends, in which they relate the supernatural experiences they had while staying at the castle. In one of these, the writer, a gentleman, was awakened one night by an extraordinary feeling of intense cold at his heart. He then saw in front of him a tall female figure, clothed from head to foot in red, and with its right hand raised menacingly in the air. The light which illuminated the figure was from within. He lit a match and sprang out of bed, but the room was empty. He went back to bed and saw nothing more that night, except that several times the same cold feeling gripped his heart, though to the touch the flesh was quite warm. But of all the ghosts in that well-haunted house, the most unpleasant is that inexplicable thing that is usually called it. The lady of the house described to the present writer her personal experience of this phantom. High up round one side of the hall runs a gallery which connects with some of the bedrooms. One evening she was in this gallery leaning on the balustrade and looking down into the hall. Suddenly she felt 2 hands laid on her shoulders. She turned round sharply and saw it standing close beside her. She described it as being human in shape and about 4 feet high. The eyes were like 2 black holes in the face, and the whole figure seemed as if it were made of grey cotton wool, while it was accompanied by a most appalling stench, such as would come from a decaying human body. The lady got a shock from which she did not recover for a long time.
Nobody knows who or what the elemental is. Some believe her clearing of the oubliette released a dark and terrible spiritual entity. In fact, she wrote of many encounters with it. Taken from the writings of W.T. Steed and is based on Mildred's discussion of her first encounter with the elemental. You will note her telling of this story bears much similarity to the other account. One is inclined to wonder whether or not the elemental has much to do with her imagination as a writer than that of a seasoned investigator of all things paranormal.
One night after 11, Mrs. D had gone to her own room, where she had been joined by her husband, but after some conversation he had gone downstairs again. At 11:30, his wife came to the stairhead and, leaning over the balustrade, called out for him to come upstairs. Nothing was further from her mind than the ghosts whom she had up to that time never seen, although, of course, she had heard the family legend of their existence. As she was looking down into the hall, she was suddenly conscious of two hands being placed upon her shoulders and looking round to see who it was. She was horrified to find herself looking into the face of a figure about her own height, which had placed one of its hands upon each of her shoulders. Whether it was in male or female shape, she could not say, but what she saw beyond all possibility of mistake was a human figure, looking as if it were made of grey cotton wool, which had placed its hands upon her shoulder and looked straight into her face. In an agony of fear, if the stair rails had not been in the way, she would have flung herself into the hall. But as it was, she ran downstairs to her sister's room, where she fainted. On recovering, she stated what she had seen. She had received such a fright that it was a fortnight before she had recovered from the nervous shock. Her testimony is perfectly clear and unmistakable. She has never seen a ghost in her life, either before or since. She was not in the least nervous, nor was she thinking of the possibility of any apparition appearing when she was startled by the sudden pressure of the spectre's hands upon her shoulder. The ghost did not speak, but simply touched her and confronted her when she turned round. What came of it she does not know, nor has she seen it again, although it is taken as a matter of course that it is still going its rounds in the castle.
Still, the current owner, Sean Ryan, reports that since he took on the castle in the early 1990s, nothing untoward has ever been experienced by him. From my own perspective, I agree. Apart from the foot dragging sound in the chapel, I also heard the repeated sound of a heavy cell-type door being opened. But suffice to say, there wasn't any door in there that could replicate that sound. And the oddest incident was during the morning in the kitchen area, where Sean cooked us a breakfast. Next to my table, I distinctly heard a creature growling, but nothing like a dog. Could that have been the alleged elemental? Unfortunately, we will never know. I found the castle quite active, but nothing on the scale of other properties I have engaged with in the rest of the British Isles. But like everything related to the paranormal, these properties have their good and bad days, and regardless, I would rate LEP as very active, but perhaps in a much more less dramatic way than the time of Mildred Darby. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this show, please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and of course hit the bell icon for any fresh updates.